Leonard, David's daughter. Nice to meet all of you today. Today's podcast is gonna be, Daddy, do you want to say it?
It's the best of 2024 year in review here on Concavity Show. Well, hey Matt, Happy New Year to you. How was the end of holiday year festivities for you?
Happy New Year, Dave. It was pretty good. I like that we kind of stick to our routines, you and I do, in this way of doing our sort of year end after the year is actually over. So some people, they release their year end thing in like early December.
December 1st, yeah.
And that's like the year isn't actually over. So
yeah,
we've had time to...
That bothers me.
We've had time to look back and reflect on it. And, I was thinking about 2024 in terms of reading. For me, it was actually kind of like a tough year. I felt a little bit unfocused and a little bit of a struggle to find reading time. And like a lot of people, one of the main struggles I have is with my phone. Like it's 9 p.m., 10 p.m., and I would lay down and I'm in bed, and it's very mind-numbing and soothing and relaxing to just scroll through your phone rather than to leave it in the other room or put it in the other room and pick up one of the 200 books that's on my bedside table.
Does it touch the ceiling? Your Tibby Red stack?
Almost, yeah. But
it's a giant Jenga tower of death.
That's like a good time for a New Year's resolution, is to resolve to get better about that and find time. And just, the stage of life that I'm in, of like my oldest child is senior in high school and my youngest is 14, very involved in a competitive soccer league where we travel a lot. And so the times that I have time to read, even on the weekends, are very few and far between. And so it's like late at night. So just reading wise, I hope that 2025 is a better year for me in terms of finishing books. I have no problem buying books. It's finishing and reading them.
That's a non-issue.
Finding them time to read. But how about you? Have you struggled with any of these issues?
I mean, insofar as like I have for the last almost decade, I guess you could say, like every year at New Year's time, like, hey Dave, you have any resolutions this year? Yeah, I'd love to read more books this year, Right. It feels kind of pathetic to me that as someone who does a podcast about books, I'd kind of on average read around 20 or so a year, which is like every 2.5 weeks a book, which is fine, but like, I don't know, it'd be nice to get up to 40 or 50 books a year. But I've just never been able to accomplish that in the last decade or so since we've been doing this show. So it was a very average year of reading for me, and so in terms of pacing, at least, I think. But yeah, if I didn't have a smartphone, I'm fascinated to know what my stats would be about how much more reading I would do. I suspect it would be a profound amount more than it is.
I will say one thing I've never been great about until the past 12 months has been tracking my reading. I really just haven't cared as much as some people to pay attention to how many books I read or buy or start and don't finish. But I actually did a lot more of that in 2024. And so that's maybe part of why I feel so depressed about it.
Because there's a record.
Right. I mean, I actually think that I've read whole books somewhere around 40, which is a lot.
Oh, that's good.
And I don't have time to talk about all of them today.
Sure.
But some of those, I tracked all the books that I bought, and I bought probably 80.
Wow.
Which is a lot.
That is a lot.
And again, some of them were like things I knew I wasn't really going to read, but I was going to get a signed book at the Texas Book Festival or something.
Yeah. It's more of a trophy than a intention.
And I also wanted to, it's one of my resolutions to be better about checking out books from the library. I'm on the board of the library. I love the library. I want books to circulate at the library. And so it just sort of creates more pressure too, of like, oh, I checked out these books, I better read them, or
Yeah.
at least
does,
make an
yeah.
attempt. And I think, it's sad, but I don't know that I finished any of the novels that I checked out from the library. Like, it was very ambitious. Like, I would bring home like 4 or 5 novels and then be like, oh, I don't actually want to read any of these. I want to go read these other books that I already own, right?
Yeah, ones that are yours.
But
I get
anyways, I think in 2025, I will get better at least about making lists of stuff that I like and I want to read as like a goal for, self-improvement. That's part of why
Yeah.
I do this. It's like,
Yeah.
I think it is good for me to spend more time with books.
Yeah, it is. It's good for the fighting the ennui, I think. I've only been good at keeping track of reading because of this episode every year. If we didn't do this episode, I would not like keep a list of stuff that I've read or watched or, listened to over the year. But because of this episode, this annual episode, I keep like a meticulous record of everything I read and engage with. So thanks for that to this podcast for keeping a paper trail for me. So you have something of like a bit of a reflection on like the year of our show, Matt, with Concavity Show. We put out 7 episodes this year, so life's busy for Dave and Matt, and especially for me having young kids. It's kind of a time in life where it's very hard to find time and energy for extracurriculars like this. So you've done a great job picking up some of the slack that I've left behind this year with doing some episodes on your own without me. So you and Don Huff had an episode, you and Matt Lowell had an episode, and Lauren Elkin most recently, and I loved listening to all of those. I was obviously sad that I couldn't make more time for them, but really great job, Matt. You've done
Thanks.
Excellent job keeping things afloat for us.
I for people who don't have a podcast where they read books, especially with a co-host, I would tell them one of the struggles of that is like, you and I need to agree on a book and read it at about roughly the same time and then schedule it roughly at the same time. And, those 7 episodes you said, I would say there's 2 or 3 that we tried to get done in 2024 that scheduling wise just couldn't make happen.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think we have a couple more, we had planned, I would say at least 9 or 10, and then there are 2 or 3 more that will get done in 2025 that just for scheduling purposes, that's one of the hardest parts of this is that, me doing those solo episodes, some of them are just because I really just want to talk to the person and you haven't read the book or talked to them. And then some of it is just scheduling. Like I know you did read the Lauren Elkin book.
I sure did. I read it over the winter break here. I loved it. It was fantastic.
And so we kind of have a policy when we talk about our top 10 books of the year of, excluding those books that we read for the show.
Oh, yeah, for the show.
But I will say, Lauren Elkin's book that came out in September was fantastic.
Yeah, it's phenomenal.
And as I said in that episode, I really like and recommend her other books as well, particularly that one, Flanoose, which I'm a big fan of. So I went down a rabbit hole of reading a lot of Lauren Elkin's other books,
Nice.
which, I'm not going to say it's not one of my favorite books of the year. I'm just going to put it on sort of the Pantheon list, right? Same with Jessica
Has
Anthony.
been explored. Yeah, totally.
Right. Jessica Anthony as well. I mean, one of my favorite writers, Jessica Anthony, has a new book out. I'm going to read it immediately, no question. And we're
Absolutely.
just lucky to get to talk to her. So,
speaking of which, I had a very cool thing happen in my life yesterday, which is I did The Convalescent with my English 11 class as a novel study recently for our magical realism unit. And Jessica Anthony came and zoomed in with our class yesterday and gave us about 40 minutes of her time to talk about Rovar Fleegman and all of the ensuing wildness of The Convalescent. And it was an incredibly wonderful conversation with her. My students sort of brainstormed a list of questions. As we read the novel, we kind of checked in, like, anything you want to ask Jess at this point. And so we had a few different sort of thematic categories of questions, and we went through and had a chance to ask some of those. And she riffed, and she had props. Like, she showed us a lot of the books to show us on the screen that are in the convalescent, you know, like books from Rovar's library, like the Book of Water Polo and the Isaac Asimov book and all the books about Hungarian history and things like that. So she was incredible. The students had a really good time hanging out with Jess. So huge shout out to Jessica Anthony. What an amazing person, and just an absolutely generous national damn treasure, as a friend Matt Luder would say.
And what what a cool person she is, but also like what fun it must have been for her to get to a chance to talk about her first novel again.
Yeah, because it's been a while. It's from 2009, right? So
yeah.
It's been out for about 15, 16 years now, and I'm sure that's fun for her to kind of revisit. She was very lit up about it, so
that's really cool.
And we also got to talk to Adam Levin again this year. That was great. And Benjamin Labatut was a huge highlight to get to speak with him. Like, his 2 books that I've read are some of my very favorite I've ever read, I think.
Absolutely. Super brilliant dude.
Yeah. And a year ago, like this month, we had Ben Diamond on, who's an awesome listener. And he sent us another audio file this year of his top stuff of the year. So huge shout out to Ben Diamond for continuing to share his favorite stuff of his year with us. So should we get into it, Matt? Should we get into some books here?
Yeah, let's jump into it. So I've got my sort of top 10 list, and I don't know how you want to do it. You want to go back and forth of I do one, you do one, or maybe we do 2 at a time, or how do you want to do it?
Yeah, we could go. Let's go 1 at a time. Do you have them ranked, or are they just kind of like a general, no particular order? Top 10?
Mine are no particular order.
Okay.
I don't have them ranked. There are some that are kind of grouped together for me. And I guess, if you don't mind, I'll start out by saying I have 2 books that kind of go together at the top of my list, which are both graphic novels. So I read, I wouldn't say a bunch, a handful of really good graphic novels this year. And I have mentioned this in years past, like I think it was 2 years ago when I talked about Chris Ware's book, Rusty Brown, which is one of the best graphic novels of all time, I think. And the one that I would compare to it this time around that I think is one of the most ambitious books, period, I've ever read is a book called Sunday by Olivier Schrauwen, who is a Belgian artist and writer. This book is published by Fantagraphics. I'd never heard of him before. It was recommended to me on Twitter by our friend Biblioclept, Edwin Turner.
Oh, yeah.
And I saw his pictures of it, and I was like, wow, that looks very much up my alley. I liked the style of the art. And then when I got the book, it's as big as a phone book. Like, it's a huge physical object. And the book is all set in one day. It's all takes place in one day of what goes on in this guy's life.
Is it a Tuesday or
Sunday? The title of the book. Guess what? Very cheeky question.
That's what I bring.
What I was going to say is, like a film, graphic novels can do things that text-only books cannot. And it will do things like have multiple sort of timelines going where there might be the top of the page, what's going on in this guy's head, and then what's going on with his wife in the second half of the page, and then different thought bubbles, which sounds complex, but actually it's really intuitive when you look at it. And then he'll have some like flashbacks in there that are drawn in a different style than the main sort of day. So it's very easy to just sort of look at it and glance at it and say like, oh, this must be, something else. And it's clear, like once you get the hang of it, that's the flashbacks. And then the color palette of the book changes throughout the day. It sort of starts out more like yellows and greens, and then it's more reds and purples by the beginning of the day, and then dark blue by the end of the day. So like flipping through it, you can really see like the progression of the day as well. That's just cool. Visually. So it's a really ambitious book. I think it's really well done, and I hope more people read it. And then the other book that I found really pleasurable to read and really well done and smart and intelligent is a book called Blood of the Virgin by Sammy Harkham. And
Sick title.
It's it's about a guy who lives in LA and writes B movies for a crappy little studio in 1974. And he himself is an immigrant, and he has marital problems. And like I say, he's trying to make it as a writer and director, but is really just kind of stuck working for this really kind of crappy little film production studio that does B movies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this was initially published as, serialized story. And then Sammy Harkham, who's sort of a legend in comics and graphic novels and, sequential art, I would say, over the past 30 years, he collected it like the Chris Ware book was all serialized. The Rusty Brown was published over many years and then collected into one big book. So was this Blood of the Virgin by Sammy Harkham. But I think the story is really moving, actually. It's a really kind of domestic story,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a very LA book. It's a very cool style visually. Like, it's got a lot of full color, almost like a magazine cover mixed in with like pages of black and white. And so it switches from color and black and white whenever the sort of storyline. You also go on set with the writer. Like, he's doing a movie called Blood of the Virgin. It's a B movie.
Okay.
So there's also this subplot of like going on set in the movie The Blood of the Virgin and some of the other B movies that they're making. And those are really visually stunning as well. So that's two of my top books, I would say,
great.
are both graphic novels. So
Oh,
now
cool.
that I've given two, why don't you give us two? And I should
Sure.
say before you go that we'll have all of our lists in the show notes.
For sure. All right, we'll type them out. Well, speaking of religious themes, one of my favorite books this year that I read was called Dayspring by Anthony Oliveira.
Yeah.
And this was sent to us by Cameron, who worked at Penguin Random House Canada up until recently. He's recently switched to a different publishing house. But he sent us a few books this year that he's like, hey guys, I think you will just like these. Enjoy. And Dayspring was one of them. I'd never heard of it before. And the cover is like really visually arresting. It's like half of it is kind of a Renaissance painting of John the Apostle. And then the other half is like a photograph of, someone in, contemporary Toronto probably. And it kind of like puts their bodies together in like a fluid, kind of as if they're the same body. And this book is very wild. It imagines that John the Apostle and Jesus had a romantic relationship together. And all the words of Christ are in red. And it kind of does a really cool time thing where a lot of it is in like first century Judea. And then a lot of it is in like contemporary day and age in Toronto. And it's like them in the basement watching like a movie together. And John's dad comes down when they're fooling around, kind of a thing. So it does like really cool time jump stuff. And I just found this book to be like, it is so poetic. It's so beautiful. A lot of it's like very recognizable to anyone who's familiar with the New Testament. And some of the stuff is like verbatim, but then, Oliveira will put in like a very funny or different twist on like a final phrase of a passage or something like that. Like, for example, there's one where like the Pharisees come to Jesus and ask him about like, this woman like married a guy and he died, and she married his brother and he died and she married his next brother, and there were 8 brothers all the way down. Whose wife will she be in heaven? That's like something that happens in the Gospels, right? And then in this book, he changes it to say, Jesus says, don't ask me stupid fucking questions. And that's the whole page.
Yeah.
I think I texted that to you.
Yeah.
And like, it's so funny. And like, it paints Jesus in a way that is like very crass, also very hypersexual. Like, this is a very sexually explicit book of a queer romance between John and Jesus. This is a book that like evangelicals will want to burn. It would be very offensive to someone with like conservative politics and religious beliefs. But I loved it. I thought it was phenomenal. And as someone who's kind of like in like a twilight sort of phase, or kind of in a phase of life of kind of like, having been in Christianity and now kind of like, either leaving it or kind of like finding themselves on the very far fringes of of any kind of relationship to that, it kind of made me feel like more interested in theology stuff than I have been in like a long time. Just like, oh, this is a really like moving human portrayal of Jesus. And it kind of was like, right, Jesus.
And
okay.
Most of that book is like, is it like poetry or prose poetry?
It's quite poetic, yeah. So some pages are just like, definitely like prose poetry, and then some are more kind of narrative. Some are kind of are like dialogic. They look like a conversation, from the Gospels, like I mentioned. And so like the way that it's laid out on the page is really, really nice to read. Some pages are very fast, like you just read them very quickly. The most moving page that I can think of is there's one from the perspective of the Roman centurion who's nailing Christ's hands into the cross, and he's narrating like what he's saying to Jesus as he's like hammering the nail through his wrist, and it's like really tender, and there's a lot of kind of compassion in it, which is bizarre because the Romans were not a compassionate empire, but he's like kind of tenderly like talking him through the process, like, okay, this part's really gonna hurt. I don't have the exact pages, but I just found it to be like one of the most beautiful like paragraphs I've read in a long time. So Dayspring by Anthony Oliveira. If you haven't read it, I really, really deeply recommend it. It's beautiful.
It's a great book.
Yeah. And then continuing with, I guess, sort of Catholic religious imagery, Claire Keegan. I had a few books I read by her this year. Small Things Like These is one that I read and really enjoyed. This is a lovely little novella that's about 100 pages. You can read it in like one sitting, no problem. About a man who delivers wood in a small city in Ireland, and he comes upon a Magdalene laundry, like a place where women who have had children or become pregnant out of wedlock are kind of living in sort of a monastery, sort of kept away from society, as a sense of sort of religious shame. And he does a delivery to this place, and then where the story goes from that is quite profound and beautiful. And I think Claire Keegan is one of the best living writers right now. I know George Saunders has said that she is like kind of a living embodiment of Anton Chekhov. So her writing feels very much of that tradition. And I know they just made it into a film as well, which I am going to be hoping to see in the next couple weeks here. I also read Foster by Claire Keegan, like back to back. I read those two short novellas, and I found Small Things Like These to be the more standout of the two, but Foster was lovely as well. Have you had any Claire Keegan?
No, I've seen her
Matt?
books. I've seen her books, and I've seen my friends buy them and read them and like them. And I'm interested in them because they're short.
Yeah,
and,
yeah, it's a plus. You're trying to hit 50 books in a year. She's a good writer for that.
For sure.
Exactly. All right, you got a couple more for us.
Yeah, so this year, or last year, I should say, 2024, there were several of my favorite living writers who published new books. And those include Nicholson Baker. He had a new book. Sarah Gerard had a new book. Right. Adrian Tomina had a new book. But the one I want to talk about is Willy Vlautin. Willy Vlautin, one of my all-time favorite writers, he published his 7th book in 2024 called The Horse. And it's a short book, but it is super affecting and memorable. And it's probably the most memorable book that made an impression on me that I read all year.
I somehow missed that this exists, this book.
Didn't get a lot of publicity, didn't make a lot of other lists. And I don't know why, because, I think he is sort of carrying on a tradition that's maybe more like Steinbeck, although his characters are more ruined in a way like Bukowski or something. And the main character in this book is an old man who is living up on a kind of a shack in the middle of Nevada, and it's winter and there's no electricity, there's no running water, and this guy's he's 67 years old, and one day a horse just shows up at his front door and the horse is like maybe blinded and in bad shape, and he doesn't know how to help this horse. And then you get a lot of this guy's backstory, which was that he was a musician and was pretty talented singer-songwriter, but playing in pretty crappy bands that played in casinos all over, Reno and Vegas and Lake Tahoe and all these crappy little casino bands. And, if you don't know much about Willy Vlautin, he himself is also a singer-songwriter, was in a band for many years called the Richmond Fontaine, now in a band called the D-Lines. And, part of what he does in this book is talk about songwriting, which I don't think he'd ever done before. And there's just tons of kind of made up fictional song titles throughout the book. And, I love sort of lists of titles. That's one thing that I like to write myself, is just, here's 100 book titles and I can make them up. Is that there are also, 3 or 4 whole songs that he's written for the book that appear, the whole lyrics are in the book as well. Mm-hmm. So you get this whole guy's backstory. How did he end up here? And it's sad, like it's tragic and it's depressing in some way. But then there's the other story of like interspersed in that of like, what's going on with this horse? Right. How is he going to help this horse? He doesn't really have a car. He's in the middle of nowhere. How is he going to save this horse? So that book I think is extremely powerful. It's very short. It's under 200 pages. And I would say it's, if not my number one, in my top 3 novels I've read all year, The Horse, Willy Vlautin. I was very excited when he has a new book out. So hopefully he publishes another one, soon. Hopefully he writes a lot.
This man knows his horses, right? Like Lean on Pete.
Lean on Pete is a horse.
All about the horse, yeah.
Yeah, but he's written other books about boxers, about, alcoholics. There's a lot about drinking in this, a lot about gambling. It's just, sad people who've ruined their lives in some way.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Willy Vlautin because my friend Cale Judy, who does a podcast called Album versus Album that we've talked about on the air before, he messaged me like a day or two ago and he's like, "Hey Dave, here's my top 10 like books of the year Substack," and I was like, "Awesome, you'll hear my top 10 soon, like on the episode." But Willy Vlautin was on his list. He had Lean on Pete and another one as well. So we were texting about Willy Vlautin today, like 2 hours ago before this episode. I was like, "Oh, cool to see Willy on your list." And he's like, so we kind of discovered him, independently.
Yeah, I'm a big fan.
Yeah, he's great. Cool.
So that's let's say third one. Why don't you give us another one?
I read a book this year called The Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which is another Irish novel. I read a lot of Irish fiction this year. And Paul Lynch has written a fucking dark and amazing book in Prophet Song, which is a dystopian, a very realistic dystopian novel about what would happen if a kind of like right-wing sort of borderline fascist party took over in Ireland. And she's married to a unionist leader who is like the head of the teachers union in the country, and he gets detained by some men late one night who come from the government, and he disappears for a great period of time. And then the novel is about his wife's just personal experience of society sort of unraveling at the hands of this right-wing government. Her children are very involved in the novel and what happens with them, and it is like truly one of the more haunting dystopian fiction books that I can think of. I know is up for a lot of awards and stuff in 2023. Can't remember if it won the Booker or was shortlisted for the Booker, but it did very well. So it's like it's not this is not news to anybody, I'm sure, me bringing this book up, but I really like this book. It's terrifying in all the best ways.
Oh, that's cool.
And unfortunately, very prescient, I think, for where we're at again.
Yeah, I have not read it. I feel like I have seen it multiple times, but not picked it up.
Yeah, it's good. I'll vouch.
All right, my next book, which would be number 4, is also a novel that I read towards the end of 2024, but it turned out to be one of my favorite books. It's called The Book of Losman by K.E. Semmel, Losman, The Book of Losman. And I'd heard of K.E. Semmel because he was a translator, and he had translated a book that I had really liked and read and reviewed called Rock, Paper, Scissors by the Danish writer Naja Marie Aidt. And I thought that was a really underappreciated book. I loved that book. And so, I had followed this translator, Semmel, and then he came out with his own book, his debut novel, published this year. And I was, honestly, it was one of the best books I read, in that maybe the only book I read all year that I literally could not put down. Like, I wanted to just keep turning page after page after page after page. And the book is set in Copenhagen. It's about a writer, translator, much like the author himself, who suffers from Tourette's syndrome. And he ends up undergoing a sort of experimental study to find the root cause of his Tourette's syndrome, which he believes is maybe related to some trauma in his past. And there's a drug that he takes. There's an experimental drug that he sort of is given in this laboratory setting that allows him access, like, not even in a dreamlike state, but in a really sort of visceral way, access to his memories. So the thing is a book about memory. The idea of your memories is sort of way that we tell our stories about our own lives to ourselves. And the whole thing sort of ends up going awry. I'm not going to spoil it, but I really enjoyed the craft of the book. I thought because he's a translator, he's really, excellent at crafting sentences. And the character itself, I mean, forget the plot. I feel like any great novel is about the characters, right? And the character is just fantastic. So I really recommend that book, The Book of Losman. K.E. Semmel. Something also very quaint and cozy about being set in Copenhagen.
That's one of my favorite cities.
Yeah, I've never been there, but
great weekend there in 2014.
I have a friend who lives there, and I've seen movies and pictures, and this looks incredible.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
So yeah, I would say that Willy Vlautin book is the top book, but the K.E. Semmel book might be up there as well for me.
Okay, nice. That's cool. I hadn't heard that one. I like the sound of that. Just looking at my list here, I've got a few on my list of favorite reads this year that we had them as guests. So like When We Cease to Understand the World, The Most, Scaffolding, those are very strong books. So I'm kind of looking down my list a little bit more. Speaking of Irish literature, I also read The Bee Sting this year by Paul Murray, who's the writer of Skippy Dies, right, which was a pretty popular book about 10 years ago or so. I thought The Bee Sting was great. It's a chunker. It's like a 600-ish page book, or high 500s, I think. And it just kind of follows like this married couple in Ireland in a sort of a small town and their kids. So it's pretty domestic. But there's a lot of kind of time warping stuff with, when this couple met, when sort of like before they were married, all the sort of family politics stuff, and then, their marriage 20, 30 years later and how things have played out. I know it got quite a lot of press. It was on all kinds of, year-end lists and all that stuff. I got it for Christmas last year, and then I read it like pretty shortly after. But I quite liked it. I thought it was a good doorstopper of a novel. Very well realized. Characters were, significantly developed and all that kind of stuff, and it really shows the complicated messiness of inner turmoil that we all live with as human beings. So I thought that was good. Have you had a chance to check that one out?
No, I think it's one of those books with Skippy Dies. Also, like, I own it, and it's on a shelf to be read someday in the future. So I'm glad to hear that you recommend it.
Yeah, I like Skippy Dies. I think The Bee Sting is probably the stronger of the two. Like, it had more like gravitas to it, I think, about like, what does it mean to be a human being? Probably a bit less levity though than Skippy Dies. So
it's interesting.
So yeah, I spent a lot of time in Ireland in the pages.
Yeah, you did.
It's kind of been a running theme for the last couple of years for me, actually. Yeah. All right, you got a 5 and 6 or so?
Yeah, my next book is a nonfiction book, but it was one of the best books that I read, and it was super interesting to me, and a lot of other people I know read it. And it's a book called The Notebook by Roland Allen.
Nicholas Sparks.
Wrong one. This is an actual history.
You knew I was going to say that,
The
though,
Notebook.
right?
Well, there's a subtitle here that I didn't write down, but it is an actual history of the technology of the Notebook.
Oh, yeah. Well, this just sounds like your shit, doesn't it?
Right. And it's sort of amazing that like no one else had really done this before. But he really traces the whole history of the technology of paper as folded, and people are able to write things down in a way that they could put into their pocket. Mm-hmm. And there's some sort of ancient Greek technology of a little clay tablet that was almost like a little mini Etch-a-Sketch that you could fold in half, and it would still preserve the writing, but you could sort of wipe it clean and rewrite it again. But paper itself originally, is separate from vellum, which was made from animal skin. Paper itself made from cloth and old rags and stuff, and cotton paper. Originally, one of the interesting stories in the book is like it was banned because some kings believed that most of the writing that was being done then was religious and monks copying texts and stuff, is that they were afraid that they didn't want the scriptures to be associated with like dirty old rags, whereas like the blood of the lamb, well, we got to sacrifice a lamb to go and make this sheet of vellum. They were okay with that, but something like a dirty underwear or something could be ground up and made into paper. They were like, no, that's illegal. And it really didn't catch on paper in Europe as a sort of technology until like the 15th century in Italy. And he goes into this technology of a product that was called the Zibaldoni, that was made and folded and sold and mass produced, where you could write things down. And it really helped with, business and ledgers and, part of the dominance of that. The Italian kingdoms at the time were due to this sort of record keeping.
Fascinating. That
and
sounds
then
cool.
It goes all the way up through our modern sort of reinvention of the moleskins and Bob Dylan's notebooks and Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, and it's a really fantastic book. I highly recommend it. The Notebook by Roland Allen. So top book of the year for me.
Cool.
That's 5 of mine. So what's next for you?
All right. I read a lovely little hardcover book this year called Coexistence by Billy-Rae Belcourt, who is an Indigenous writer in Canada. And this is another book that was sent to us by our friend Cam over at Penguin. And I've seen Billy-Rae Belcourt around, quite a lot. It's the first full book of his that I've actually ever read. And it's a collection mostly of short stories that feel pretty probably like autobiographical, but they are technically short stories. And a couple of the pieces that really stuck with me. One was, it's about a man who moves into, goes back to the town that he sort of grew up in but left as an adult and has come back for some reason. And he's living in this house that previously was lived in by I think 1 or 2 nuns that worked at a residential school. And the story is about him sort of grappling with the ghost of, the concept of residential schools, but specifically this one particular nun who lived in this home while she worked at and, carried out, awful human rights violations in one of these religious, usually Catholic residential schools across Canada, which ended in 1996. The last residential school closed. Wow. So really recent, in our lifetime kind of history. So that story I found to be really, really quite impactful. And then the last story in the collection is about a man who goes back home to live with his dying mother, basically, and just being with her through the end of life process. I found it to just be really beautifully poetic and devastating, and it's a lovely little collection. He's a queer writer as well, so he's got a lot of queer romance aspects and themes in this book, and it's a really celebratory look at Indigenous queer romance. And so I thought it was really, really a lovely book, Coexistence by Billy-Rae Belcourt.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Must be better known in Canada than in the U.S.
For sure, yeah. I think his literary fame is probably pretty local to this country. But like, you know, there's been like a massive sort of renaissance or explosion in indigenous literature in North America in the last like 20-ish years or so. So we're seeing just so much good literature coming out of that community, and you know, in Canada especially, like a very marginalized group of people historically, and so seeing their stories and their voices coming through in the publishing industry has been great. And this year I've been teaching an English First Peoples senior English course this semester. I really want to bring in a couple of the pieces from this book, but I've sort of run out of runway. Like final exams are in 2 weeks, so just like that's the hardest thing about being an English teacher, is like there's so much you want to do and envision, and then it turns out that things just take way longer than you expect them to, and then you're like, oh man, I only got through like half of what I really wanted to do with this class, you know.
Next week, read the complete works of Shakespeare and get back to me. It'll be a test.
Yeah, I've opted to not teach any Shakespeare this semester, so yeah. We do Jessica Anthony instead, which is more my speed. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, next on my list is kind of a hybrid book that is part essay, part memoir, part something else. Like it has photographs and some argument in it. And it came out in 2019 or 2020, I forget. But I just read it in 2024. And it's by one of my favorite writers, which is Lewis Hyde, who wrote The Gift and Trickster Makes This World. This book is called A Primer for Forgetting, Getting Past the Past. And it's a very strange book, which I love. I love everything about this book.
I feel like Marksonian a little bit.
He actually references Markson several times throughout it. So yes.
Cool.
And it sort of jumps all over the place. It's divided into 4 sections, which he calls 4 different notebooks, and basically says something like, you know, he got tired of mining his notebooks for content and wanted to just build upon them. And so this is sort of like his raw notes to himself. And the 4 notebooks are called Myth, Self, Nation, and Creation, which doesn't tell you anything about a primer for forgetting or memory. And so I was going to read a bit from, he says something about, at the very beginning of the book, what is this book? And he says, many years ago, reading about the old oral cultures where wisdom and history lived not in books, but on the tongue, I found my curiosity aroused by one brief remark. Oral societies, I read, keep themselves in equilibrium by sloughing off memories which no longer have present relevance. So that's interesting. And it sort of takes it from that note to sort of investigate what memories have been lost or sloughed off, but also what is worth preserving. And like I say, the form of the book is super interesting. You know, he's getting older. This might be his last book that he writes. Okay. And he says something like, I found myself weary of argument, tired of striving for mastery, of marshaling the evidence, of drilling down to the bedrock to anchor every claim, of inventing transitions to mask the native jumpiness of my mind, of defending myself against imaginary swarms of critics. And like all of this just resonated with me. I mean, he's probably 40, 50 years older than me, but I feel like that jumpiness of the mind and sort of not needing the transitions that maybe that connective tissue I mentioned even in the Lauren Elkin interview, that a lot of people don't need now. You know, I just felt like found myself nodding in agreement as I was reading this book. And there were so many little interesting stories and anecdotes baked into the book that, you know, I'm glad he felt free enough to do this kind of a book, and that it got published by Picador, which is a big, you know, top 5 publisher. So if you're interested in the type of sort of weird books that I am, I think you would like this book.
That sounds good.
Lewis Hyde, A Primer for Forgetting.
Cool. That sounds nice. My next book that I enjoyed this year was called Assembly by Natasha Brown. It's a very tiny book. You read this book too?
Yeah.
All right. It's a very tiny book about a woman who lives in the UK who's, essentially facing the glass ceiling problem of being a professional woman in the working world, of just, being under sort of critical scrutiny by men at all times. And then there's some stuff about her fiance, and the kind of generational wealth of that family, and her kind of grappling with what does it mean, to potentially be part of an upper class sort of system in UK society, but also still having these kind of, I would say, leftist or socialist sort of values. Really short book. It's under 100 pages. I found it to be really beautiful, really thoughtful, and just a real kind of good feminist shot.
My interest in it was that it's somewhat experimental, and it feels like, I don't know, a stream of consciousness, some sentence fragments, a little bit jumpiness too, and the reader has to do some work to figure out what's going on. Yeah, and I felt like the style of it was super interesting. That was what interested me.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's one of these books that Rachel was just like, "Oh, I have this from the library. I read it. It's great. It's due back tomorrow."
Right.
And I was like, "I'll read that in one or two sittings."
Absolutely.
On holiday. Yeah. So I love that book. I'd recommend that. What's next for you?
My next book is also a weird hybrid book that I really loved. And it is called You'll Like It Here by Ashton Politanoff. And he's a very interesting writer. This book is published by Dalkey Archive Press. Came out, I think, 3 years ago, maybe. I don't know exactly when, but it is ostensibly little snippets of old newspaper stories from Redondo Beach, California.
Oh, okay.
He is sort of obsessed with his hometown, which is Redondo Beach.
I think I've been there once, when I was 19 or 20.
He is also, like I am, obsessed with old newspaper clippings. And, there's just really bizarre old stuff used to make it into the newspaper. It was sort of like, pre-internet, a lot of weird stuff that's on the internet. Some of it was in the paper back in the day. But it's very clear that he has also shaped these little fragments in a writerly way. So each page might only be one paragraph, and it's a funny little story or an anecdote from an old paper, bizarre usually. But it's clear that, he's not just transcribing newspaper stuff, he's shaping them, editing them in some way. And then there's also, it becomes clear, I would say, at some point in the book when you're reading that some of them might be invented, they're not actually from an old newspaper. So then the question becomes of
reliability.
Are they all made up, right? Are they all transcriptions from old newspapers? Are they?
Yeah.
And I think some of them must be, but I don't really know. It's not really told or explored, but I found this just to be a delightful, weird little book. And, I didn't know anything about Redondo Beach. You don't really learn a lot about Redondo Beach. There's surfing there. It's the beach, it's the coast, but it's more of what was life like in, I don't know, 1912 or 1901 or something. And then, just the weirdness that is inherent in, I don't know, life or California life today was sort of the same, 120 years ago.
Yeah, right.
So it's a strange little book. I don't really know what genre it is, but I love it. And, I know he's written some other kind of more traditional short stories, and this is just a really weird collection. You'll like it here. Redondo Beach.
That sounds
Ashton
cool.
Politanoff.
I'm very interested in that. Nice. My next book for me that I loved this year this is a very local book. This is a book by a writer from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. It's called What Remains of Elsie Jane by Chelsea Wakelyn. And Chelsea turns out to be like a friend of a friend. And so I was hanging out with these friends, and they're like, oh, my best friend wrote a novel. I think you'd like it. You want to check it out? Lent it to me. And this is after I went to their wedding. So my friend Dave got married to this lovely woman named Keely, and so it's one of Keely's best friends, this writer Chelsea Wakelyn. At their wedding, which was about a year ago, or just under a year ago, Chelsea gave a speech, and the speech was incredibly wry and funny, and opened with this time where, when they were like first friends as teens, Keely came over for like dinner and decided to be like possessed by a demon, to act like she was possessed by a demon or something. Wow. Like as kind of like a weird performative, theater kid kind of a thing.
It's a bold choice.
Yeah. And so that's how the speech sort of opened, but she also had these like funny facts about like on this day and, whatever, January of 1994, this happened, someone set the world record for eating the world's longest hot dog, and also Keely did this weird thing in my family's kitchen. It's like really funny, and like one of the best speeches I've ever heard at a wedding or any kind of public event. And then so shortly after the wedding, Keely gave me this book and I read it, and it's about a woman whose husband has died like fairly young, and basically about her kind of like emotional tailspin for like a year of trying to come to terms with the fact that the love of her life is gone, and what to do with being a mother to his children, and just a really like profound exploration of grief. And the novel kind of goes in a weird direction where she answers like basically like a Craigslist post about someone who claims that they can do time travel. She becomes quite interested in meeting this person and like time traveling back to, before her husband died, and, seeing if changing history is possible. But it's incredibly funny. It's incredibly sad. It explores, a lot of just very earthy sort of desire, and I found it to be very moving and just like really, really well written. And then very fun too, in that like all of the place references are like places that are like a 2-minute drive from my house, or like a 10-minute drive, or like downtown Victoria. So like the names of pubs that I go to, are in this book and stuff. So like having that very kind of local experience of I know all of these places really well, that's a great. If you're into checking out more Canadian fiction, which I know is certainly dwarfed by American fiction, and like most of my reading is in American fiction, right, even as a Canadian. But Canada's, we've got some good writers coming out these days. So.
And what was the title again?
It's called What Remains of Elsie Jane. And it turns out this book is like incredibly autobiographical, because this whole story happened to the author, where her husband died like very unexpectedly in his early 40s, kind of a thing. Wow. He kind of had like in the book, the husband has like kind of a secret life of addiction that he kept from the narrator, from the protagonist. And so it's also about her coming to terms with like, who was my husband? Like this whole aspect of his life that I did not know about, that he kept secret and ended up causing his death, with addiction stuff. So it was a great book.
All right. 8th on my list is a memoir, and it's a memoir that I read in advance of the David Foster Wallace conference this year in Austin. And I should say, the conference was a year highlight for me. Our keynote speaker the first day was Amy Wallace Havens, Wallace's sister. Yeah. Our keynote speaker the second day was Joy Williams, along with Jim Gower. And Joy Williams was there to promote her new book, which is super interesting, and I'm not going to talk about it because I feel like I'm not smart enough. It's called,
that's how I always feel on this show, Matt.
Concerning the Future of Souls, and it's sort of all about the angel Azrael, and there's 100 different stories, but I don't want to talk about that. What I want to talk about is another writer who was there at the conference who read from his book, which I really loved his memoir, which is called Caged, by Brandon Lamson. And Brandon Lamson is a poet and a teacher at the University of Texas. And Caged is a memoir published by Fordham University Press, all about his time teaching English behind bars at Rikers Island in New York City. And if you're not familiar with Rikers Island, it's a city jail that is, known for being extremely tough and absolute brutal place to live or work. And this goes on, I think, like 6 years he has this job of teaching inside the jail. And it is an island, like you have to take a bus that goes across a bridge to the island itself every day. So just even getting there is quite an ordeal. And half the book, is about his experiences with the people who are incarcerated, with the people who he meets working there. The other half of the book is about living in New York City as a young man and sort of exploring the underworld at night. And that is fascinating. And there's a lot of him sort of exploring sexuality, exploring who he really is or wants to be as a young man. And like I say, this is a memoir. It's true. It's all based in his life. And, I was lucky to get to meet Brandon at the conference this year through the University of Texas and have him, present some of his memoir at the conference. And just really, I really enjoyed reading the book itself, because anytime a poet, I think, writes prose, you're in for a treat.
Sure. Yeah.
Most of the time.
Yeah, that's for
his
sure.
poetry is also amazing, and I also feel like maybe I'm not smart enough to talk about his poetry in an informed way. And the memoir, I think, is accessible to everyone, but it's also beautifully written and surprising. It's really not what you would expect. I am not, I would say, not always drawn, because I'm not an English teacher. Like, some memoir of a teacher doesn't inherently interest me.
Right.
But it's all the other stuff going around in his life that I think makes this memoir so fascinating. So I highly recommend it. Caged by Brandon Lamson.
Cool. That sounds great. Next for me, I got around to reading some kind of like older books that I've had on my radar for a long time, and people have been peer pressuring me to read. One of which was The Fortress of Solitude
Jonathan Lethem.
by Jonathan Lethem. And Matt Luter's been on my case for years about finally getting to this book, and so I got it, and I read it, and I liked it a lot. It's a great book. It's magical realism. It's very interested in growing up in a particular neighborhood in New York in the 1960s, 70s,
early 70s, maybe?
Early 70s, yeah, I think. And there's a profound interest in comic books and superheroes in this novel, and where it goes in terms of like superpowers entering and pervading the world of the characters in the book is really cool and kind of funny and interesting take on a sort of superhero narrative. And the ending of this book is really rad. I had such a cool experience reading like the last 10 pages of it. It takes a really, really unexpected and interesting turn at the ending. There's a cool twist. There's a lot about music. There's a lot about like soul music and sort of Motown and that sort of era of African-American music in the U.S. Yeah.
I think it might be his best book. I mean, it's a super pleasurable book to read. And, I was interested initially because I lived down the street from Park Slope for a long time and could walk down there. And, a lot of it hasn't changed. Some of it has changed, obviously. But, obviously there's a Superman connection with the Fortress of Solitude.
Yeah.
But I would say if you're interested in this book, he revisits some of that same neighborhood in the book that he published last year, which is called Brooklyn Crime Novel. Oh yeah. So I think Brooklyn Crime Novel is actually a pretty good companion to Fortress of Solitude. Nice.
Cool.
So yeah, 5-star book for me, Fortress of Solitude.
Yeah, it's solid. Like lots about graffiti and like street art culture, which is really fun. Yep. Lots about just like being in like an adolescent and bullying kids in your neighborhood, yoking them.
I mean, when you're that age, that is like on your mind a lot.
Totally, yeah. And the way that the characters age, you know, it's kind of like a multi-decade novel. So you kind of live with these characters for like a few decades as they, you know, become like, you know, 12-year-olds to like 40-year-olds, you know, and seeing how everyone's life plays out is really cool in this novel. I liked it a lot.
It's great.
Yeah.
So
all right, I have number 10 or so.
I have 2 slots left.
Cool.
My next one is also a memoir, and it's a book that actually Don Huff had given to me called Avid Reader by Bob Gottlieb. And it's his memoir of being the editor of Simon & Schuster, and then later editor of The New Yorker, and then later at Knopf. And, you know, this guy is maybe, you know, the most famous editor of our lifetimes. Like, he just passed away last year or the year before.
Oh, okay.
And he was subject of a documentary along with Robert Caro called Turn Every Page, where he had edited Robert Caro's books on LBJ. But Gottlieb is famous for, you know, acquiring Catch 22, which he also named. It was initially called Catch 18, and he changed the name of it to Catch 22. But I mean, a million other stories of, you know, working with a who's who list of people in celebrity memoirs and, you know, the upper echelons of New York society. And then the story of how he, you know, went to the New Yorker is super interesting. I think if you believe his side of the story, the whole saga of, you know, he could have done anything. What does he want to do as a writer and an editor? Is he, even though I think he was sort of from a different time, he stayed humble in some way, which is rare. Like, he was not out to do this for sort of personal glory in a way. I think he was just really obsessed with books and literature and reading his whole life and wanted to make them better. And so I really enjoyed reading that book. I you know, devoured it in chunks because I enjoyed it so much. And I think anyone who is an avid reader would be drawn to a book that's titled Avid Reader.
Yeah, funny that. That sounds good. I like that.
All right, what's number 9 on your list?
This year I read The Left Hand of Darkness finally by Ursula Le Guin, which I'd been meaning to read for, you know, good handful of years.
You finished it?
I finished it. Yeah. Have you attempted to, but
I've
not
attempted
this
it,
book?
and I was like, you know, because other people recommend it, and I'm like,
Yeah.
Maybe this is for me, and then I start reading it, and I'm like, maybe it's not for me. I don't know.
Yeah,
So
I
convinced me to
expected
finish
a very different experience than what I had from this book. It's a really slow book. Not a lot, I guess, happens, and it's like absolutely hardcore sci-fi. Like, we're on other planets here.
Yeah.
There's different species of beings. Like, this is not a literary fiction in the sense of, like, you know, realism. This is like hard sci-fi. And so I think I was like, I don't know what I expected out of this book, but what I got was certainly not what I expected. I don't know if I loved it or if I would recommend this book, but the more, it's kind of a slow burn. The more I think about it, like throughout the year, the more I'm like, yeah, you know, I think I do like that book. I think I did enjoy the experience of reading it. It's kind of a love story, like an interspecies love story between the protagonist and another character. It's a very cold novel, so most of the book is set in like tundra kind of a setting. Like, it's very cold. They're in like mountains buried in snow. Kind of a survival story as well, like trying to make it through being in this frozen wasteland. So I saw someone reading this like in public recently, and I walked past them, and I, you know, like kind of bit my tongue a little bit, like almost said something to them, but then didn't. But yeah, I think like if people are interested in sci-fi that also feels, you know, interested in like the deep human concerns that we have, then it's probably for them. If somebody is like not interested in space travel, other planets, things
I
of
mean, it's
that
probably
nature.
her most
They'd probably
famous
take
book,
a pass. Yeah, for sure, right? Like it's the one you always kind of hear most associated with her, or at least I have.
I mean, I'll say, I have several of her books and I've tried to read them. The only one that I've really loved and read was a book called Always Coming Home,
Okay.
which I think was published much later. And it's sort of it's sort of a weird book in that it's like a bunch of documents about a people who, no longer exist. And sort of like an anthropologist discovers all these records. And, some of them are like songs, and some of them are poems. Some of them are like really complex. Like I haven't read it in a long time. It's a Library of America book I got for Ursula Le Guin, and really liked that particular set of like understanding this society from this way, like not just being told a story about them, but like looking at their primary documents. I found that really interesting approach. So
Cool.
do you think I should go back and try another shot at Left Hand of Darkness?
I don't know. Like that's kind of the thing, is like it's a book that I read this year. I'm not sure if I'm trying to promote it right now, or I'm just saying like it was a fascinating experience to read and to mull on over.
That's
over
a
the
no
last
for
year.
me. That's a no.
It could be a no. I mean, yeah, like it's certainly. I'm saying it's not for everyone.
Yeah. That's fair
But
enough.
the more I think about it, the more I like it. You know what I mean?
I still have it. So
Yeah. Okay, so does that bring us to around number 10 or so?
Number 10, and I'm going to like cheat and mention like 3 or 4 books all at once.
Okay, I'll do a similar thing. Cool.
And the main one I had slotted in here, which is Adam Kelly's The New Sincerity, which is an academic book.
Have you read this yet?
Some of it, so that's why I'm cheating by putting it in with
Right.
some other books that
Yeah.
it's really fantastic book, but I have to read it really slowly. Adam is obviously incredibly brilliant, and I feel like the essay that he wrote in 2009, or came out in 2009, The New Sincerity, was probably one of the most cited Wallace essays ever. And so I was waiting for him to develop into a book. It took obviously a long time, 15 years ago, but it's still, I think, a relevant conversation, and something that people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s struggle with, is how sincere or ironic should you or your artwork be, or the artwork that you are drawn to, and that to me is a cyclical problem in an interesting way. So I want to mention that book again. It deals with a lot of texts that I also haven't read. So there's Wallace in it, but there's also other writers that I have not read all of their work.
Right.
But
who else does he tackle in that book?
So there's 6 chapters focused on different writers. Here's a list: Susan Choi, Helen DeWitt, Jennifer Egan, Dave Eggers, George Saunders, Dana Spiotta, Colson Whitehead, and then David Foster Wallace. So
I know some of those names.
For sure. And we've read a lot of, obviously I've read most everything by Dave Eggers, George Saunders, and Jennifer Egan. Not so much on Susan Choi. Actually have read Helen DeWitt, but Colson Whitehead not as much. So anyways, I feel like I've got to do some of the primary source reading, but the book itself is fantastic, and obviously Adam put a lifetime of work into this book, and I feel like it deserves careful attention. The other ones that I will cheat and say that I read that I really liked are, one is an art book by an artist called Zoe Leonard, called Al Rio to the River, that is set, takes place on the border of Mexico and West Texas. And, I got to see some of this when I was in West Texas over Thanksgiving at the Chinati Foundation, and I bought the book in Marfa, and it's a 2-volume book. One is like a book of essays, and the other one is a book of the artwork itself, which is a lot of photography. And it's really a stunning thing to see on exhibition. And so, anytime I see a really great exhibition, I want to buy the book. I love art books. So I'm cheating here by putting that in this 10 slot as well. But I did really love that book and wanted to at least mention it.
Cool.
That's my number 10, which is a cheat.
Okay, I can do a cheat number 10 too. Martyr by Kaveh Akbar is a book that I started in 2024 in like the last few days, and I finished it like a few days into 2025. So
We'll take it.
well, if we're okay to take it, I would say this book is awesome. I really loved it. It's about an Iranian protagonist who moved to the U.S. At a very young age with his father. It's about his experience as like a university student. It's about his experience having lost his mother as an infant and sort of the gaping void of not having a mom in his life for his whole existence. And he's sort of a bit of a wastoid kind of a character, but he's also an aspiring poet and writer. And he ends up taking this trip to Brooklyn to go to an art exhibition where the artist is doing a residence as they're dying of cancer. So like their final days they're spending living in the museum, talking to like lineups of people that are coming through for one-on-one conversations. And so what develops between him and this artist is a really satisfying payoff to a book. So having talked recently a few minutes ago about Fortress of Solitude and good endings, I found like the ending of Martyr was really exceptional. I love this book. To cheat a couple more into this 10 slot, Every Arc Bends Its Radiant by Sergio Della Pava just came out really recently. I think it was November. I read and liked this book. Sergio continues to write, I think, some of the best dialogue in novels. His characters, the way they talk to each other, is so fucking funny. He's got a very like really like witty, wry, smart alecky interlocutor usually in every conversation, and this book's no exception. And all I'll say about that book is stay tuned. We might see more to come from us about that book soon. And then the book Same Bed, Different Dreams by Ed Park got a lot of press this year. I saw it in a lot of places online, and I read it. And I will say that the first half of it did not overly grab me, but by the end, I really enjoyed it, and I would put it, sort of at the tail end of this list of books that I enjoyed this year. If you're interested in like Korean history and military history and political history, this is a book for you, for sure. It's a big deep dive.
On that note, I do want to say something about what I like about doing these lists, which is talking about books that we like. And that one thing I don't appreciate is when people put out lists of books that they hate or books that they think are crappy writing, or they're like, let's rag on some books. Let's throw out something you think is trash. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to my children about this actually, with being careful about the amount of like hate that you put out in the world. And I really don't think that it is wise or productive long term. And I really didn't give a shit when I was younger. I'd talk about anything, and hatchet job, right? Make fun of something and poke fun at it. And I think now as I've gotten older, I'm very sensitive to dwelling on my own mind on stuff that I don't think was very good. Mm-hmm. But also giving that sort of public airing of negativity, I think is really bad, and I think makes the world a worse place. Mm-hmm. And I would caution other people from doing it as well. And that, I think morally it's bad, that you shouldn't do it. I think we've tried to be quite intentional in the last decade on the show of being celebratory about things that we like, right, and propping up things that we think deserve more attention rather than ragging on things that we think deserve less, maybe. Well, and a lot of that is subject to taste. It's very subjective. Sure. And then it's also, all kinds of problems you get into where people think, oh, this book should have done this. And it's like, well, that's your fucking opinion. That's not.
Well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Well, and it's like, how do you judge a book or a work of art? And often, when I was reviewing books a lot, one of the criteria is like, does a book sort of aim for a target and hit it cleanly? Mm-hmm. Do you wish that it aimed somewhere else? Well, you can't judge it on that. It's not aiming to be that. Mm-hmm. And I think people who enjoy ragging on books too much, there's something wrong with you, man. Like, you should be talking about more stuff that you love rather than stuff that you hate.
Yeah.
So I really have gotten more sensitive to that, I would say, as I get older. And I think social media sort of reinforces the toxicity of that.
Sure. I think probably too, like, you published a novel recently and so you're probably a bit more sensitive to, like, what would it feel like if someone put this book on a top 5 list of, like, most disappointing books of 2024 or something like that, right? Like, so you appreciate more now, I think, like, what it goes into writing a book and how much of your life you pour into it and the effort it takes. And so you're probably a bit more, like, empathic about shitting on stuff, you know?
Sure. And I think generally it is just something. I'm not saying don't ever do it, but that you got to be careful with putting that sort of energy out into the world. I really believe that.
Yeah, there's like a karmic property to
and it's like
promotion or anti-promotion.
People who think that everyone thinks they're a good person, right? Everyone thinks they're good, and yet people continually do stuff that I think makes the world a worse place. So where's this sort of mental acrobatics about? And I think you need to question your choices if you're out there talking about books you hate a lot.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sort of cap off our list. Is there anything for 2025, Matt, that you're excited to read? Do you have like a sort of what are your next few books that you're excited to check out?
Yeah, I don't really believe in like people who post those lists of like, here's my plans of what I'm going to read. I don't really believe in
25 for 2025.
I don't really believe in doing that. I think, yes, there are a lot of books that probably will come out that I will buy, and I'm looking forward to reading one. I would say the only one I want to call out, which I'm really excited to read, is by a writer you've mentioned in the past, which is Avner Landis.
Oh, yeah.
And he has a new book coming out called The Delegation, and I'm really excited to read that.
Cool.
One of the goals I would say I'd set for the year is to read a book that was sort of lauded, that I'd had on my bookshelf I always wanted to read. It's a book that has won like the Pulitzer Prize and stuff. There's a nonfiction book called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, which is about the migration of African Americans from the South to the North.
Oh, okay.
And I'd always wanted to read that book, and I just started it. So I guess that's one.
Yeah.
What about you?
Nice.
Any reading plans?
I'm currently reading James right now, which is another huge
Percival Everett
book. Yeah. And I'm about 65 pages into it, really liking it. That should be done hopefully by next week. I have a copy of Pay As You Go by Escort David Johnson, which was a big McSweeney's title this year that got a lot of press, and I've seen it around tons and tons online. I hope to read that one in the next month or two.
I would say if people want to hear us talk about some other media, including maybe music, movies, TV, I don't know, podcast, games, all that stuff of the year is going to be in our bonus episode for our Patreon subscribers. So if you are interested in becoming a sustaining member of the show and you want to get access to all of our bonus episodes, you can do that at patreon.com/concavityshow. And I still have some like stickers and pencils if we want to send out to our newest Patreon members. Do you have anything to add about our Patreon, Dave?
Well, speaking of Patreon, we have 2 new patrons in the last, since we did our last episode together. And so we want to shout them out on air and give them a big thanks. We want to thank Bunk Hertzdog.
Oh, I know Bunk Hertzdog. He's a friend of mine. Thanks,
Awesome.
Bunk.
Thank you, Bunk. And also to Hunter Valo. Or it could be Valet. I'm not sure.
Thank you,
Hunter. However to pronounce your last name, whether you're French or Italian or some other ethnicity, we appreciate your support very dearly. And thank you ongoingly to all our patrons who help keep us afloat here. We could not continue to do the show without your generous patronage. So big thanks to you this year.
Indeed. And I would say that's pretty much it for this episode of 2024 wrap up. This is our first episode of 2025.
It is. And I wish you a happy year of reading, Matt, to come.
Same to you, Dave. And
may we be more
productive,
aspirational. Maybe we hit our aspirations more this year than we did last year.
There you go. I'll take that.
Cool.
And to everyone else out there, I would say thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It's been a while since we've had a review. And we have links in our show notes to our Threadless store. If you want to rep us, if you're a hardcore fan and you want to rep some merch, we have Concavity Show merch. You can also follow us for free in your favorite podcasting app, or follow us mostly on Instagram and X, aka Twitter. We're at Concavity Show. You can also email us, concavityshow@gmail.com. And that's how we get feedback. If you say, no, you guys are stupid, or, hey, what was the name of that book you mentioned? Or I just want to add my own list, or just want to say hi, email us, concavityshow@gmail.com. And we will be back with a new episode soon.
Catch me now as I sing into darkness. I thought to be extinct.
Hi, welcome back. Today we are going to do another podcast. So my dad, David, is going to say it.
David. This is the best of 2024 year in review here on Concavity Show. You don't know what it's called, do you? Say here on Concavity Show.
Here. No, Daddy, don't. Dad.